Welcome to Men in the City. In today's video, we're going to talk about the revolt against weak men. The world today, whether you believe it or not, is ruled by what I call the gerontocracy. And gerontocracy is a word that means rule by old. Today, the bureaucrats, the elites, the wokesters, the beta bureaucrats, whatever you want to call them, the company men that rule the world, that pilot major corporations, that preside over governments, that run the SIFI banks, the systemically important financial institutions, they are weak men. And they tend to be weak, old men. How has this happened? How could something like that occur? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. I look at the world in terms of cycles, as many do. And just as there are monetary cycles and there are social cycles, there are ebbs and flows of the tide, there are also changes in epochs. And right now we're living during a period of transition. We're leaving what I call the age of prosperity, and we're entering into the age of scarcity. Now, the age of prosperity and the age of scarcity are mirror images of one another. In fact, you can't get one without the other. They're polar opposites that catalyze one another. During the age of prosperity, the age that we're currently in and are about to leave, there's a particular personality type that thrives. And the reason for that is because the age of prosperity is not a building period. It's not a period of creation where the brick and mortar of the prosperity was laid. Actually speaking, most of that happens, if not all of it, during the age of scarcity. The age of scarcity is the building period. The age of scarcity is when the rail lines are constructed. It's when new technologies are really invented that disrupt and change the entire structure of production. In the United States, as an example, the age of scarcity, or the building period as I describe it, really occurred during the 1860s to the 1890s and the 1920s to the 1950s. These two distinct periods were rather difficult periods of time. In the 1860s, we were coming into our own as a country on the heels of the Civil War, which was an incredibly destructive and an existential crisis that rocked the entire country. But the fallout from that was really the conquest of manifest destiny. It was the period during which the continental rail lines were built. It was a period in which industry began to sprawl across the United States. And the men who built these amazing communications highways and networks and systems and so forth, whether it was the telegram or it was rail lines piloted by coal and the rise of the oil industry, as an example, were very hard-nosed, tough men, truth tellers, you might say. The 1920s and the 1950s were very similar. You had builders like Henry Ford that invented the assembly line and brought us new technologies like the automobile. You had a period of electrification that lit up cities from coast to coast. The personality type that created that industry, that laid the track for all of that prosperity, was very different than the people who dominate today. The people who dominate today began as the maintainers. They're the administrators, the bureaucrats that come in after the building period and essentially preside over what's already been built. Well, you have to ask yourself, what is the personality type that's rewarded in an environment where the structure has already been created? Well, that is the gerontocracy that we live with today. In order to get ahead, you don't exert a lot of courage or tell a lot of truths. Rather, you conform and you concede. You comply with whatever the groupthink tells you to say and do. Because if you don't, you're squeezed out, right? You're marginalized, or you're deprecated, because the ethos of the bureaucracy, of the corporate structure, demands rigid conformity. And so the men that are at the top of Fortune 500 companies today, they're not builders. The men that run governments, the men that are driving industry, you might say, these men got to the top by carefully plotting a path for decades, avoiding confrontation, avoiding conflict, and threading the needle between a range of different potential minefields that could destroy their path to the top. As a result, you get very weak-kneed, spineless men that aren't capable of telling the truth. They're not capable of exerting a dynamic character in order to drastically change direction. Now, of course, there are exceptions to every rule, but by and large, the Justin Trudeaus, the Emmanuel Macrons, the Joe Bidens, even King Charles in England, these are men that haven't done much in their lives except climb bureaucracies, which is why what we observe from them is a kind of rigid conformity and a pliable character that will bend or ebb and flow with whatever the consensus happens to be at any given time. This system works until it can't work anymore. And usually that happens when weak men become extremely negligent, when they neglect entirely the institutions or the bureaucracies of the corporations that they preside over. And it is that period that we have reached today. The age of scarcity is coming because the problems that we face, the breakdown of these institutions, has now become so acute, it's beginning to affect our lives in negative ways. Prosperities, abundant energy, the free availability of liquidity or financing, it's all drying up. And the gerontocracy, the weak men that rule, what I call beta tyrants, weak men in positions of power, they have no answers. And so riots in the street are beginning. You're seeing them in major cities like Paris, even parts of the United States, and the gerontocracy has no answers for this. Eventually, problems spiral out of control to the point where you get a revolt against weak men, a revolt against the gerontocracy, and the beginning of an age of scarcity that follows. Ladies and gentlemen, that is where we are today. That is what the neo-masculine movement is all about. It is a revolt against the old order, the gerontocracy, the beta tyrants that have run our societies aground, and it's just beginning. Stay tuned, and we'll talk soon.